Hello, friends. So, what we're talking about today are two philosophers who are who are very different from one another. Um, Frankfurt and Sartre are really on very different ends of the Western philosophical spectrum, but nonetheless they hold not even similar ideas, but really interestingly radical ideas about the nature of responsibility and free will. So, despite the fact that they're very different from one another, I think it's good to pair them because they offer such counterintuitive views of responsibility. Namely, both of them hold that responsibility goes deeper than I think we intuitively understand it to. Okay, so let's situate Frankfurt and Sartre within the larger spectrum of the course this summer term. So again, we have our package deal, which is a kind of Platonic Cartesian view in which minds are understood as disembodied, that that we have a kind of unmoved mover free will, that we're rational, we're asocial slash agendered. Now we said that part of the not officially part of the package view, but strongly implicated by the package view, is that we're responsible for those actions which we perform freely, right? And so this week in particular, we've been taking a look at philosophers who challenge that idea, right? That sort of implied element of the package view. So with Frankfurt, the way in which Frankfurt challenges this part of the package view is he says that we are responsible for things we've done, even if we could not have done otherwise. So just as an example, suppose, for the sake of the argument, suppose that you're at a party, right? And suppose that I'm at this party too. And suppose that you're having a good time with all your friends, blah, 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 and imagine that I go over and I lock the door. So when I lock the door, you can't leave the room, right? You can't leave the party. But imagine you're having such a great time, you don't even think about leaving the party. So you're responsible for staying at the party, even though you can't leave, right? Even though the locked door is preventing you from leaving. That is, you could not leave the party. You can't leave the party. But that's an aside from the fact that you're responsible for staying at the party. Right? So, we're going to talk about that in just a little more detail in just a couple of minutes. But that's Frankfurt's big idea, right? That you're responsible for staying at the party even though you can't leave. Alright, so how does he get there? Well, the first thing he does is he distinguishes between two related ideas. The first one is what he calls the principle of alternate possibilities. The principle of alternate possibilities holds that a person is morally responsible for what she's done only if she could have done otherwise. So that is to say, if we find a person responsible, then that means she could have done otherwise, right? She could have acted differently. What's an example? Well, suppose you pickpocket me and you steal my wallet. Well, I hold you responsible for that, and in holding you responsible, what I'm saying is that you could have acted differently. That is, you could have not stolen my wallet. So that's the principle of alternate possibilities, right? You're responsible. Your being responsible implies you could have done things differently. You could have acted otherwise. Now that is distinct from the doctrine of coercion. The doctrine of coercion. So the doctrine of coercion says that moral responsibility is excluded by coercion. So an example of this, imagine that you steal my wallet because somebody has kidnapped your family and is holding them hostage, and the only way they'll release your family is if you steal my wallet. Now under those conditions, you're coerced into stealing my wallet. So what Frankfurt is interested in is he's interested in saying that if you're coerced, you're not responsible. But if you're responsible, that doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't have done otherwise. Right? So how do we get there? Well, he has us consider the case of Jones, right? So we imagine that this person, Jones, plans on performing some action, right? So Jones plans on, let's say, robbing a bank. And let's suppose that somebody threatens Jones, right? Threatens to beat him up if he doesn't rob the bank. But here's the twist. Jones made up his mind to rob the bank prior to the threat. Again, Jones decides to rob the bank, then he's threatened with assault if he fails to rob the bank. Right? So the important point to notice here is that Jones made up his mind to rob the bank prior to the threat of assault. So, how do we interpret this? Well, Frankfurt gives us 4 ways to think about it. So, we're going to go through each one of these. And so the first 3 are going to be sort of answers. It's not really going to give us what we want, and it's the final way to interpret it that really gives Frankfurt what he wants, right? But it's important to go through the other ones too, just to sort of see how we can think about the case. Okay, so straight ahead. So first, we might suppose that Jones is an entirely unreasonable person. And once Jones has made up his mind to do something, nothing could steer him from that. So come hell or high water, Jones is going to rob the bank, right? The threat of assault had absolutely no effect on him whatsoever. So, is Jones coerced in this case? So Frankfurt's intuition here is no. Quick sidebar, notice here that Frankfurt gives us a number of thought experiments to get our intuitions going, right? So just something to keep in mind as we're doing this. So, back on track. So Jones is unreasonable. Once he makes up his mind to do something, damn it, he's going to do it. And in this case, the thing he made up his mind to do is rob the bank. And so the threat of assault has no coercive effect on him, right? It has no effect on him. He's not coerced, fully responsible for robbing the bank. Okay, that's the first way to think about it. Second way to think about it. Jones is actually kind of a great big wuss, right? And he is, as Frankfurt puts it, he's stampeded by the threat. So, Jones makes up his mind to rob the bank, and then somebody comes along and says, "You rob that bank or I'm going to beat you up." And Jones is like, holy crap, right? And in this, he's so shaken, he's so upset by the threat of assault, that he completely forgets his earlier decision to rob the bank. And he does whatever the guy threatening him tells him to do. So again, it goes like this. Jones makes up his mind to rob the bank. He's threatened. And in the second case, Jones is so startled, he's so unnerved by the threat, that he completely forgets his earlier decision and does whatever the guy who threatens him tells him to do. So in this case, Frankfurt's intuition is that Jones is not coerced. Wait, strike that. Reverse. Frankfurt's intuition here, with the Jones being a great big wuss, is that Jones is actually coerced in this case. Why? Well, because he's so terrified of this threat that he completely forgets his earlier decision, right? It's not a willful forgetting. He's so scared, he's so upset by the threat, that he just completely forgets the earlier decision and does whatever the threatening person tells him to do. So he robs the bank, not because he made up his mind to do it, but rather because the person threatened him. It's just sort of coincidental that prior to the threat, Jones the wuss made up his mind to rob the bank. So that was the second case. So we have the first case, Jones is entirely unreasonable, and he is responsible. Second case, Jones is kind of a pushover, and is stampeded by the threat, coerced. Third case. Alright. So, the third case gets a little bit complicated. Well, not really all that. Yeah, you'll see, friends. So, in this third case, Jones makes up his mind to rob the bank. The person comes along and says, "Rob the bank or else I'm going to kick the crap out of you." Now, Jones is impressed by the threat. That is to say, he recognizes that this threat is something to be feared. And Jones would have decided to rob the bank if Jones would have robbed the bank had he not already decided upon it. So, in other words, the case is this. Jones makes up his mind to rob the bank. First. Dude threatens him. Second. Jones recognizes that the threat is a really serious one, and if he hadn't already made up his mind to rob the bank, then he would make up his mind to rob the bank. Again, the conditional here is if he had not already made up his mind to rob the bank, then he would make up his mind to rob the bank because of the threat. So it's kind of like Jones is saying, holy crap, that's a serious threat. I'm glad I've already decided to do whatever it is he's threatening me to do, or whatever he wants me to do. So, is this the case of coercion? And Frankfurt here says, well, he's not really convinced either way, right? He thinks that this is simply not a clear case of coercion, right? So you might want to say yes, because he would have changed his mind had he already not settled it. But on the other hand, he settled his mind, and so yeah. And so the threat doesn't have any coercive force, but it would had he decided differently. So yeah, Frankfurt just kind of says, I don't really know. It's maybe not a clear case. Okay, so those were our first three cases. So again, first case, Jones is unreasonable, gives 0 fucks what anybody says. Second case, Jones is a great big wuss, totally bowled over by the threat. Third case, Jones would change his mind if he hadn't already decided in favor of whatever the threatening person is telling him to do. Right? So here's the fourth case. In the fourth case, we explicitly introduced another actor, another person. Right? This other person's name is Black. Right? So we have Jones and we have Black. So Black wants Jones to rob the bank, and through the use of drugs will force Jones to rob the bank if Black has to. Right? So in other words, Black is willing to slip some drugs into Jones's morning coffee or to drink in order to drug Jones in order to manipulate him. Now, importantly, Black doesn't like to make his force known. So, Black is willing to manipulate Jones into robbing the bank. But Black doesn't want Jones knowing that Black is doing the manipulating, right? That Black is working behind the scenes. So, whatever Jones's initial inclinations are, Black will make it so that Jones decides to rob the bank. Right? So again, whatever Jones' initial inclinations and his initial preferences, Black will make sure that Jones chooses to rob the bank through, manipulative drugs or whatever. Hiring a mad neurosurgeon, post-hypnotic suggestion, stuff like that. Now, Jones decides to rob the bank. So we ask ourselves, what do we do with the fourth case? Well, Frankfurt looks at it this way. He says that in this case, Jones decided to rob the bank, and Black never had to exert any kind of force on Jones. So we can think of it this way. We can tell the very same story about Jones, but without mentioning Black, and nothing has changed, right? So Jones decides to rob the bank, and Black doesn't intervene with that. That case is basically the same as a case where all we have is Jones deciding to rob the bank. So if we think that Jones is responsible for robbing the bank because he decided to, without Black being in the picture, then we hold Jones responsible for deciding to rob the bank in the case where Black is in the picture. So again, we have Jones decides to rob the bank, no Black in the picture. We have Jones decides to rob the bank, Black is in the picture. In the no Black case, we hold Jones responsible, because it's a perfectly straightforward case. Jones decides to rob the bank, we hold him responsible for robbing the bank. In the case with Black, however, Jones decides to rob the bank, but Black would have exerted, Black would have worked his force to make Jones rob the bank had Jones sort of started to choose differently, right? So Black would have met him at a bar, and unbeknownst to Jones, Black, might have dropped some drugs in Jones's coffee or whatever you get in a bar. Jamba Juice maybe. And Jones would have chosen to rob the bank. Here's the kicker. In the case where Black is in the picture, we hold Jones responsible. But Jones could not have acted otherwise. So in other words, in the case where Black is in the picture, there's no way that Jones could have failed to rob the bank, right? Black is going to make sure that Jones chooses to rob the bank. But Black simply doesn't have to exert any effort, any force. And so we hold Jones responsible, but Jones could not have done otherwise, right? So it's right back to the case that we introduced at the start of this lecture with the party. It's like if you're having a party and I'm there and I lock the door so you can't leave, but you stay at the party because you're having a great time. So you couldn't leave, right? So you're responsible for staying at the party, even though you couldn't have done otherwise. So, what we have then is we have Frankfurt's example here with Jones and Black as a counterexample to the principle of alternate possibilities. So in other words, we started out with this very common sense idea that people are responsible for what they do only when they could have done otherwise, only when they could have acted differently. But we find in the case of Jones with Black that Jones couldn't have acted any differently, and yet we still hold him responsible. So why is this important? Well, so think about the denial of the principle of alternate possibilities within the context of determinism. So typically, when we think of determinism, we think that people aren't responsible for their actions because they were determined to do so. But what we find with Frankfurt is that even if you are determined to act in a certain way, even if you could not act otherwise, you are still responsible for your actions, which turns out to be really kind of counterintuitive, right? That you're responsible for your actions even if you could not have acted any differently. So, again, the take-home point for Frankfurt and the counterintuitive point is that even if you could not have done otherwise, even if you could not have acted except as you did, you are still responsible for what you do.